Chapter 25. My wife tells me you told her to stop the check for the reward money. Superintendent Clyde had sneaked up on Marvel like a bad smell. That's right, sir. £1,000 is a lot of money. I thought you'd like to make sure this boy deserves it. He brought the dog back, said Clyde flatly. He deserves the money. Marvel was rendered almost speechless by the naivety of the man. What was it that plaque on the super's desk said? Something about the Lord taking over when the law was broken. Marvel suddenly wondered just how appropriate it was for a senior police officer, or any police officer, to have that motto on his desk. As if day-to-day police operations had been contracted out to the Almighty, like catering or cleaning. It smacked of the same sort of abdication of responsibility as no questions asked, as if Clyde's heart really wasn't in this crime-fighting lark. He spoke carefully. What if he pinched the dog in the first place, sir? People will do a lot for £1,000. You should have a bit more faith in human nature, John. Marvel almost laughed in his face. What an idiot. Out loud he took a more conciliatory tone. Sir, I just want to make sure you and Mrs. Clyde aren't being ripped off. That's all. Thank you for your concern, but I'm sure, and I think that should be enough. Don't you? Marvel didn't reply, but the super seemed to assume the affirmative. You'll be reassigned to another case shortly, and I'll deal with the matter from now on, thank you. Marvel remained mutinously mute. Understood, said Clyde. Marvel understood. Clyde wanted the Mitzi business over, and he didn't want anything happening that might prolong it, even if that meant ignoring an infringement of the law. Marvel understood that, and he wanted the super to know that he understood. So he looked steadily up at Clyde and said, No questions asked, sir? That's right, snapped Clyde. No questions asked. No questions asked, said Debbie. But that's what everybody puts on posters. Well, everybody's wrong. The dog, now named Buster, lay between them, its round pink belly stretched by food. Buster was allowed to have all 4 feet on the Habitat couch, while Marvel still wasn't allowed even one. People aren't wrong just because they don't agree with you, John. Marvel pursed his lips and glared at the TV. It was about koala bears, so he knew he wouldn't be allowed to change channels. Debbie was crazy for koalas. They were her second favorite TV animal behind meerkats. She'd sit for hours with her knees tucked to one side, a glass of rosé in her hand, watching the anthropomorphism of anything small and furry. She was watching them now, and stroking Buster's belly while she was talking. And now you've fallen out with your boss, she said, over something so silly. It's not silly, Jesus Christ. It's obstruction of justice by a senior police officer. Debbie sipped her wine. But it's a very small obstruction. Oh, for God's sake. Marvel picked up the remote and started changing channels. It's not the size of the obstruction that matters. What matters is that there has been an obstruction at all, and that he knew that, and allowed it to remain there. A copper's job is to solve crimes, and to solve crimes you have to ask questions. If you don't ask questions, criminals get away with crimes. Now, do you understand? Debbie made a face and emptied her glass. You're just grumpy because we had hummus for tea. No, I'm grumpy because you're so fucking stupid. There was a horrible silence, and Marvel felt guilt crawling up his neck and behind his ears. But he couldn't say sorry because he was right. She must be stupid not to see that. Debbie said nothing. She watched the flickering television while her fingers moved gently back and forth over the coarse fur on the dog's chest. Marvel ran through the channels again, but there wasn't even anything on that was better than the koalas. Infuriatingly, he'd finally made a stand over the control of the television in the only 5 minutes of the decade when nobody was showing Top Gear. Debbie watched in cool silence until he finally switched the TV off completely and tossed the remote across the coffee table with a clatter. Buster twitched and farted in surprise and gave Marvel the excuse he needed to get up and go to bed without apologizing. Chapter 26. Evans, Edith. For the millionth time, Marvel flicked through the tatty brown folder. At the back of the file was a Polaroid of Anna Buck, the transcript of her interview, and an A5 envelope containing the drawings she had done. She looked tired and washed out in the photo, but she was the only person Marvel had ever seen who looked better in a Polaroid than she did in the flesh. She was holding a plastic cup of water. The rim was just visible at the bottom of the frame. He had taken the picture himself before Aguda brought in the tea. On a sudden whim, Marvel pinned the photo to the wall under the Mitzi bumper sticker he had peeled off his car. Then he found a photo online of Richard Latham, a screen grab from a news bulletin, and printed that and pinned it beside the others. The 4 pictures sat in uneasy proximity: Edie, Mitzi, Anna Buck, and Richard Latham. He felt there was a link, some force of attraction between them, but he certainly couldn't see what it might be. Marvel didn't believe in coincidence, but he did believe in a good hunch, and he felt better for having put all the photos on the wall together. He tipped Anna's drawings out of the envelope. There were 2 small sketches, more doodles than drawings. The first was a window frame, with flowers beyond it, and a weird perspective that showed no sky. Anna had drawn one of the flowers inside the bottom edge of the window, as if on the sill. All around the frame she had scribbled blackness. The second scrap of paper, torn from Marvel's own notebook, was a confusing sketch. He turned it around a few times to try to make sense of it. Eventually, he held it vertically. A wide stand, a kinked shaft, and a thick U-shaped bit at the top. It was the kind of thing Debbie would buy from Habitat and stick 2 candles in. On the widest part of the U was the number 88. "What's this?" he had said to her. "I don't know," she had replied. Marvel didn't know either, but he pinned the drawings to the wall as well. The Anna Buck intervention in the Edie Evans case was just another shroud over a concealed truth. He almost resented that it had happened at all, but now that it had to be treated as part of the whole, or he wouldn't be doing his job. And his job, finding Edie Evans, had only become harder because of it. He picked up the phone on his desk, called DCI Lloyd, and asked him whether Anna Buck was nuts. "She's lost her son," said Lloyd after a small pause, as if that was an answer. "But is she nuts?" insisted Marvel. "She came in here yesterday with a fake baby, claiming a photo was talking to her." "Well," said Lloyd cautiously, "I'd say she's greatly disturbed." "Nuts, you mean?" "I'm not a doctor," said Lloyd. Or much of a policeman, thought Marvel. Then he asked Lloyd to send over a photo of Daniel Buck and hung up. Somebody behind him said, "Sir." Emily Aguda had missed DCI Marvel at first because he was sitting in the far corner with his back to the murder squad room and with his feet on the desk. She only noticed him then because she spotted the Polaroid of Anna Buck on the wall over his desk. After that, she recognized a photo of Edie Evans. There was also a picture of a middle-aged man in glasses, and a bright pink bumper sticker pinned underneath them with the motto, "Find Mitzi." So it was a real name. "Sir," she said politely. "What?" said Marvel without turning round. "I got that photo back from the lab." Marvel used his feet to swivel his chair around enough to see who was talking to him. When he saw Emily, he scowled. "I didn't know you'd sent it to the lab." "You told me to check it again, sir, and I wanted to get it right. They say the date on the rosette is correct, and they can't see any evidence of tampering or manipulation, only a bit of damage caused by the water. So I called the show secretary and asked if they'd had any errors on the dates on their rosettes, and she said no." Marvel stared at her suspiciously for a moment, then said, "How did you get the photo back so fast? Usually it's like putting a message in a bloody bottle." "I know Dean Frazelli. He owed me a favour." "What kind of favour?" Emily had lent Dean Frazelli her car to go on a blind date. It was a nice car, a neat little MR2 in candy apple red. Apparently, it had made quite an impression, because when he'd returned it, he'd told her he owed her one. And when she'd called and asked for his help analysing a photograph, he'd been happy to put it at the top of the pile. "You still seeing that girl?" Emily had asked him. "I am seeing a lot of her," Frazelli had answered with feeling. "A whole lot." Then he'd offered to buy her car, and she'd said she would think about it. "Just a favour," she shrugged. Marvel didn't need to know the fluff. Marvel grunted. "Doesn't make sense." "Sir?" "It doesn't make any bloody sense." He slapped the desk, making her jump. "Even if she had been kidnapped and brainwashed, or had run away and was living a new life, she's at a dog show, with a bicycle that's been in the basement of this bloody building since January last year." He glared at Aguda as if she might confess that she had made the whole thing up just to annoy him. But she said nothing. "Frazelli's an idiot," he concluded, "because that photo is impossible." He glared forcefully at Emily, but she didn't concede the point. She thought that Dean Frazelli wouldn't last 5 minutes in his job if he were an idiot. She could feel the frustration coming off Marvel in waves, and understood his reaction, but wasn't going to be cowed in the face of it. "Also, sir, I was thinking about what Mrs. Buck said about her husband." Marvel glared at her, then said, "Go on, for Christ's sake. Just because you decide to put a question mark at the end of a statement doesn't mean I have to suddenly think of an answer to a question you haven't even bloody well asked." Emily Aguda almost giggled. She was used to being demeaned because she was black, and because she was a woman, and sometimes because she was gay. But she'd never been demeaned over her choice of punctuation before, and was surprised to find it a refreshing change. She went on. "Mrs. Buck said that she didn't trust her husband around children. It struck me as a strange thing for someone to say, sir." Marvel nodded slowly. Then he said, "With children?" "Sorry, sir?" "She said with children, not around children." "Yes, sir." Emily was surprised that Marvel had picked up on it too, and so closely. Marvel fixed her with a glare. "You know she's stark staring mad, right? The hysterics and the water and the fake baby. Anyone can see. Mad or a scammer, bound to a pinch of dog shit." Emily looked at his face to see whether he truly believed that. It was hard to tell. "Perhaps," she said with what she hoped was a diplomatic note to her voice. Marvel said nothing more, but he stopped scowling, so Emily pressed on. "I just thought it was interesting, sir, given that Mrs. Buck's son and Edie Evans disappeared within a couple of miles of each other, and given that, statistically, children are at greater risk of harm from a relative than they are from a stranger." Emily stopped herself saying more. She had a tendency to over-explain things, and something told her it was a trait that DCI Marvel might not appreciate. Marvel stared at Emily, but she could tell he wasn't thinking of her, so it didn't seem weird. "James," said Marvel at last. James Buck.
"Yes, sir," said Emily.
"Okay," he said.
She started to go, and he said thank you, so softly that she wasn't sure she'd heard it. And when she turned to say you're welcome, he already had his back to her and his feet on the desk. After Aguda had gone, Marvel lowered his feet and logged onto his computer. He typed in James Buck's name and got nothing. Marvel never trusted the computer when it said it couldn't find something. He always suspected laziness, rather than an absence of something to be found. But apparently, James Buck of 148 Northborough Road had no previous convictions. He sat and glared at the screen for a bit, not really seeing it, while his mind tested and discarded possibilities. His instincts were on the alert, just waiting for the right possibility to put its head above the parapet, so that he could pounce on it. Mental whack-a-mole. Marvel got up and went over to the big map on the wall near the door, which showed the Southeast Murder Team patch. With one blunt finger he traced the roadway between Bromley, where Edie Evans came from, and Bickley, where James Buck lived. It was 2 miles of suburbia. Houses and little rows of shops, and traffic lights and schools. Now and then a small patch of green, a cricket pitch, a football field, a strip of parkland or playground. He saw nothing obvious. No reason why Edie Evans and James Buck might ever have been in the same place at the same time. Marvel groaned inwardly. He was going to have to call Edie Evans' parents. He hated to do it. He knew that just hearing his voice would bring the pain back for them, along with the adrenaline shot of instant dread or hope that she was dead or alive. Right now, Edie was neither, and that was the hardest thing of all. He reached for the phone, but before he could pick it up, Colin Brady pushed off hard from his desk, so that his chair rattled across the lino towards Marvel at speed, only slowing down a few feet from him.
"What did Abuba want?"
He grinned. Marvel was in no mood.
"She had an interesting insight," he said coldly.
"Yeah,"
leered Brady.
"I bet it's interesting inside her knickers."
He laughed to encourage Marvel to get the joke, but Marvel said,
"At least she had a bloody idea."
"Really?"
said Brady.
"Really," said Marvel.
"And I don't want to hear that name again, right?"
"What name?"
"Abuba."
Brady's expression said he suspected a joke, but he erred on the side of,
"Yes, sir."
"Tell the others."
"Yes, sir."
"Now fuck off."
"Yes, sir."
Brady slunk back to his desk as quietly as he could on casters, and Marvel picked up the phone. Whiskey used to give him courage to do shit like this. Nowadays he had to rely on just not thinking about the consequences. He called the Evans' number from memory. Mr. Evans, Mark, answered the phone. Good.
"Mr. Evans?"
said Marvel. There was the smallest hesitation then. "Chief Inspector?" And the hope and the terror were right there in an instant.
"There's no news,"
Marvel said at once, and Mark Evans made a noise like someone undoing a radiator cap, the sound of tension leaving his lungs. The next natural thing to ask would have been, "How are you?" But Marvel had been in this job long enough to know that that only prolonged the agony. How was anyone when their child had been missing for over a year, and they didn't know whether she was alive or dead? Shit was a given, he always supposed. So Marvel went straight to,
"I wanted to ask you a question."
"Of course."
"Did Edie ever go to Beckenham to a dog show? On her bike?"
"Beckenham? No."
"You're sure? Or maybe just to a park or somewhere there might have been a dog show taking place."
"No," said Mark Evans. "Definitely not."
"What about Bickley?"
Evans mused. "I know Frankie went to play school over that way." You remember the name of the play school?
Tiger something, I think.
Tiger time?
I think so. Hold on, I'll ask Carrie.
A little chill ran up Marvel's spine. Edie's brother had gone to the same play school as Daniel Buck. Edie's brother. How had they missed it?
Hello, John.
Carrie Evans was trying to be bright, but he could hear the tremor in her voice. Hello, Mrs. Evans. Marvel couldn't bear to use her first name, even though she always used his, and he didn't mind that, but calling her Carrie would have obliged him to make much more personal investment than he wanted to.
Frankie went to the Tiger Time Play School. Why? Is it important?
I don't know, Marvel told her truthfully. For some reason, he had always been completely honest with the Evans family. He supposed it was because he had worked so hard on the case, so far above and beyond what might reasonably be expected of him, that there had never been anything to hide. He couldn't even hide the fact that he wanted Edie home almost as much as they did. Did Edie ever go with you to pick him up?
Yes. If it was nice, we would walk, and Edie went on her bicycle. After a while, she left her bike at home, and we walked together. Walking's for old people.
Marvel had never heard Edie Evans's voice, but he almost laughed out loud as the words popped into his head, as clearly as if she was sitting beside him. Certainly, the Edie he knew would have wanted to ride her bike whenever possible. It piqued his curiosity. Why did she stop riding? He asked. Did something happen?
I don't think so, said Carrie Evans. Certainly nothing she told me. One day she just walked with me instead, and she said it was so we could talk. I thought that was lovely. Before that, she'd be racing on ahead and coming back to me, then racing off again. You know what I mean?
She didn't have a fall or knock into someone or get shouted at? Any kind of a fright?
Not that I know. Why is this important, John?
I really don't know whether it is, Mrs. Evans. I'm just trying to work that out.
Okay, she said.
And Marvel could almost feel the self-control it took for her to keep calm, keep answering his questions, not scream and tear out her hair. Did you, or she, ever speak to anyone, even just to say hello, on your way to or from the play school?
No. Not as a few regulars, but that was all.
But one day she just stopped riding her bike.
That's right.
How long was that before she went missing?
Said Mrs. Evans. Maybe a month. I'm really not sure.
It felt relevant, although Marvel couldn't have said how. He almost pressed the point about the dog show, but he didn't want to reveal the photo at this point, not until he was sure of exactly what it was. One tenuous clue at a time, he thought wryly. Does Frankie still go to Tiger Time? He asked.
Oh, no, she said hastily. He'll be going to big school next year, so I thought it would be nicer to, keep him at home.
She gave a weak laugh. She was fooling nobody. But Marvel didn't blame her. She had lost one child on her way to school after all. She wasn't taking any chances with the other. Do you know the address of the play school, Mrs. Evans?
Sure, said Carrie. 152 Northborough Road.
Marvel had a pen in his hand, but he didn't write it down. Instead, he thanked her and said that he would call them if he ever had any news, good or bad. The usual. Then he hung up and got his notebook out of his drawer for the second time in half an hour. He flicked to the Anna Buck interview. There it was, right at the front of the interview. The man Anna Buck was married to, but still didn't trust with children, lived 4 doors away from the play school. Chapter 27. As James cut across the forecourt to work, he saw a stocky child with pigtails squatting beside the 5 footprints. He stopped beside her. "Hello?" he said.
"Hi."
"What are you doing?" She glanced up at him, but lowered her head again before answering.
"Cleaning."
"Why?" he said.
"Just helping," she said.
He watched her pick tiny twigs and petals of blossom out of Daniel's footprints. Her hands were small and pink, and she had a plastic ring on one forefinger with a fake emerald in it. She had to keep stopping to adjust her school bag, which kept slipping from where it was slung across her back. She pushed it around patiently each time and carried on with her task.
"Do you know who made those footprints?" he said. "Daniel," said the girl. "He got lost, and this is all his mummy has left."
James felt unbalanced by hearing their lives summed up in a single, bold sentence from a small girl he'd never seen before.
"She still has me," he said.
The child stared up at him.
"Who are you?"
"I'm Daniel's daddy." The girl looked away again and carried on picking grit from the next print.
"You left the door open,"
she said. All the breath left him, as if he'd been punched. He stared down at the back of the girl's head. Her shiny dark hair was parted in the middle all the way down to her nape, and there were 2 hair clips holding the strands in place. 2 little goldfish smiling up at him, waving their fins. Was she even real? Was any of this real? Was this how Anna felt when she had her visions, shocked and sick and kicked in the belly?
"Yes,"
James said slowly.
"I left the door open."
The little girl stood up and brushed her hands together, then wiped them on her thighs for good measure. She left dusty finger marks on her black uniform trousers. She hitched her bag up onto her shoulder and looked up at James.
"You must feel terrible,"
she said solemnly.
"Yes, I do." "You didn't mean to do it, though, did you?"
"No," he said huskily.
"It was a mistake."
The girl looked down the road, pushed a strand of hair behind one ear, and took a deep breath.
"Miss Henderson says everybody makes mistakes, but it's what you do after the mistake that's important. Like, I pushed Bethany Court over because she called me Fatty Four Eyes, but then I said sorry and she said sorry too, so it was okay."
James nodded, and the girl hitched her bag up again and said,
"I had to go to school now. Bye."
"Bye," said James. They headed off in opposite directions. Before he went into the garage, James looked down the street. The girl was still there, walking away. She was real. He watched her until she turned the corner just to be sure. Then he went inside. Marvel parked across the road. Number 148 was next to a garage, which had been built into a gap in the houses, most likely caused by a wartime bomb. Just a few doors down the same sooty terrace was 152, Tigger Time Play School. It might have been a coincidence, if Marvel had believed in them. A tall man in dirty blue overalls leaned against the garage wall, smoking a black cigarette. Marvel took a photo of him, and of a Chinese kid with a broom who was sweeping the forecourt. Even through 2 lanes of traffic, Marvel could hear him singing. It was tuneless, and yet with curious little lilts and curlicues that made it sound deliberately so. The door of the flat opened, and a slim, dark-haired young man in overalls and work boots emerged. He presumed it was James Buck and took 3 photos. As Buck cut across the cement forecourt, he stopped and chatted to a stout, bespectacled girl who was squatting, playing some sort of game on the ground. Marvel took another photo. After a minute, the girl got up, and after exchanging a few more words with her, Buck walked slowly across the forecourt. He stopped briefly and looked back down the road, then disappeared inside the garage. Some commute. Marvel fiddled about until he found how to review the photos on the complicated digital SLR camera he'd checked out of work. One picture was of a blurred lorry. One was of the top of Buck's head. The third was his profile. The fourth was horribly overexposed, even though the tech moron had assured him that the bloody thing was automatic. All he could see were Buck's legs, and the girl's, under a pale blue haze. He'd have to use the profile shot. It wasn't great, but it was better than nothing. He waited until the boy had finished sweeping the forecourt and gone back indoors. Then he got out of the car and crossed the road. On a whim, he took the camera with him. There was a narrow alleyway between number 148 and its neighbor, and Marvel went down it. It was a dank passageway, green with algae from gutters that must always be blocked and dripping. The sound of the traffic muted behind him as he went, until his own footsteps were the loudest thing in his ears. It was so long since he'd been conscious of the sound of himself that it almost creeped him out. He emerged behind the buildings into a slightly wider alleyway and turned left. The rear of Tigger Time was easy to spot, because the brick wall at the back of the tall Victorian house had been amateurishly painted in a Disney-esque nightmare. There was a spotted rat with a broken leg that he guessed was supposed to be Bambi, and a gurning axeman who looked like Richard Nixon. Marvel assumed it was one of the 7 dwarfs, but only because there were 6 similar others, each armed with a different tool. The back gate was locked, and there was a skip outside filled with play-school junk. Black bags overflowing with disposable nappies, broken toys and great sheaves of shite art. Finger paintings and sheets covered with thick black wax crayon. Marvel scraped at the black with a fingernail, and lo, the colors underneath were exposed. He smiled. He couldn't help it. He was a child again. And then, just for a moment, he was overwhelmed by the sense of the past and the future colliding. Right here, in his very own hands, the hands of the child he had been and the man he continued to be, existing simultaneously. He heard Richard Latham in his head. "Your memory is my future." For a split second, the understanding was huge and brilliant, exploding like a supernova in his head, illuminating everything. Then the wonder of it slid through his fingers like silk, and he was left thinking stupidly of lottery numbers. Marvel sighed and dropped the papers back into the skip. He wondered if the mothers who cheerfully left their children at ticket time ever came round the back to look at the arse end where all the crap was. A door opened at the back of the play school, and Marvel withdrew quietly. He didn't want to make contact on any terms but his own. He walked back down the potholed tarmac. Opposite the houses, a tall metal fence ran above the steep drop down the embankment to the railway line. He stopped behind number 148. There wasn't much to see. There was no garden, just a brick-walled yard. The downstairs windows had metal grills across them. He didn't know what he'd expected to find, nothing really, but it was always worth seeing things from every possible angle. He went back down the alleyway, where a monster drip of water caught him right on the crown. When he put a hand up to wipe it away, he found what felt like the beginning of a bald spot. Great. He'd peaked. He went round the front of the building and knocked on the door of the flat. Anna Buck opened the door, already looking suspicious, as if she'd seen him snooping, although he doubted she had.
"Hello, Mrs. Buck," he said brusquely. "Can you spare a minute, please?" She frowned. He could see she didn't want to say yes, but he had saved her life, and British people found it so hard to say no at the best of times. A nation hog-tied by its own social graces. So, inevitably, Anna Buck said, "Okay," and opened the door. The flat was a mess. A blue mess. Someone had thrown a lot of paint around. It was on the taps and the sink mostly, but there were drips across the floor too, through the living room and to a door that Marvel assumed was a bedroom. There was a bucket filled with blue water next to the kitchen door. Anna Buck had been cleaning up. "What happened here?" said Marvel. "I spilled some paint." "I see that," he said. But she didn't volunteer any more. "Couldn't have a cup of tea, could I, Mrs. Buck?" She hesitated. She was desperate not to encourage him, he could tell. But she was the host, and she had to be hospitable. "I'll put the kettle on," she said neutrally. "Thank you." He sat at the kitchen table. The chair was so cheap he felt it give a little under his arse. He waited until she had made the tea so that she couldn't stop halfway through and ask him to leave. Once he had the tea, the rules said he must be allowed to finish it. She put it down in front of him, along with a bag of sugar, and he noticed her hands were blue too, right into the sleeves of her cardigan. Marvel stirred 2 spoons of sugar slowly into his tea. Anna Buck didn't sit down. She stood nervously by the sink. "I noticed the play school a few doors down," said Marvel. "Did Daniel go there?" "Ticket time? Yes." "Nice place?" "Yes," she said. "Why?" "Edie Evans's little brother used to go there. Frankie. Bit older than Daniel." Anna Buck gave a small frown, and then said, "I don't think he was there when Daniel was. I don't remember a Frankie." "No," he said, and sipped his weak tea. She hadn't left the bag in long enough. Wanted him out of there. "Did you take him there every morning, or did your husband?" "I did, after James went to work." "And you'd pick him up?" "Yes." "Daniel like it?" "Loved it. He grew up so much." She smiled. Then she stepped to the fridge and slid 2 pictures from under a magnet. "These are his. He was always drawing and colouring in. His teacher said he was good." Marvel stared down at the scribbles on the paper. Might have been a house, might have been a fish. Parents were delusional. Teachers must know it. "Very good," he said, because he needed her to want to help him. "Childcare's pricey nowadays, isn't it?" "And how?" she said. "I went back to work to pay for it. I mean, I loved having Daniel at home. But children need to socialize, don't they?" "Yes," said Marvel, although he'd never felt much need for it himself. "Do you have children?" she asked. "No." That wasn't true, but he didn't want to answer awkward questions. Names, ages, whereabouts. So he said, "Where did you work?" "I was a secretary at a little cosmetics firm in Penge, part-time, but it was enough." "Nice," said Marvel, although he imagined it was shit. Typing, tea-making, slapping the boss's hand off her thigh. "And your husband? Where does he work?" "Next door, at the garage." "Mechanic, is he?" "Yes." "Good money?" "No, that's a shame." She shrugged. "Who makes good money nowadays?" "Exactly," he agreed.
Then he tapped the camera and said, "He doesn't know anything about photography, does he? I'm taking this to be fixed." She shook her head, uninterested, and stared at his cup as if willing him to drink up and get out. Marvel changed tack. "Must have been hard on him when you lost, Daniel." It wasn't the right time to ask the question, but sometimes that could make it the right time.
"I didn't lose, Daniel," she snapped. "He did."
Jackpot. "Really?" he said, trying to sound casual. "What happened?"
"James left the door open. Daniel ran outside."
It wasn't what Marvel had been hoping for. He'd wanted to hear that James Buck had never loved his son anyway, or that he'd been a discomfortingly strict disciplinarian. Even just the impression that there was a terrible secret, something he could hang a motive on. He suddenly felt a little sorry for James Buck. Leaving a door open didn't seem like much of a crime. "I'm sure he feels terrible," he said.
"He should."
Marvel was taken aback by the chill in her voice. "He didn't do it deliberately, did he?" Anna made a face.
"Does it matter?"
"It wouldn't matter to me."
"Well, not to me," she said. "I miss Daniel too much for it not to matter."
She stopped talking, and Marvel could see the tears fizzing close to her surface. He changed the subject. "Could I use the bathroom?" She pointed through the living room and said,
"You can't miss it."
Before he'd even left the kitchen, she was filling a new bucket of warm water, ready for him to be gone. Marvel stopped short of the bathroom, glanced behind him, and opened the door to what he assumed was a bedroom instead. Bloody hell. 4 huge blue circles were scrawled across 2 walls. The rest of the room was spattered with paint. The doll thing was in a carry cot on the single bed, but even the cot was splashed with blue. For some reason, that disturbed Marvel almost as much as the walls, even though he knew now that it wasn't a real baby.
"I had to do them,"
Anna Buck said behind him. He started to say he'd opened the wrong door, but she didn't seem to care that he was in here and not the bathroom. She sat on the bed with her hands upturned on her lap and spoke just above a whisper.
"It made a bit of a mess, but everything is circles, so I had to, really."
Richard Latham's words popped back into Marvel's head. "Life's a circle, and a circle never ends." Had Latham put her up to this, too? First the photo, now the circles. Marvel couldn't see the angle, but there had to be a connection. "What did Mr. Latham tell you about the garden, Mrs. Buck?"
"Mr. who?"
"Richard Latham, the medium, from the church."
"Oh," she said, and immediately looked puzzled. "I didn't tell him about the garden. Only about Daniel."
"No, I said, what did he tell you?" She shook her head.
"He said he couldn't help me," she said sadly. "He wouldn't even look at Daniel's photo."
She had misunderstood him, and Marvel didn't think it was deliberate. Richard Latham hadn't told her about the garden. Marvel was convinced of it now. He could see no chink in the woman, apart from the obvious madness. She seemed to have no interest in Richard Latham. Now that he couldn't or wouldn't help her, she had no interest in anything but her lost child. She stared dully into the cot and said,
"Sometimes I hear him cry. You know? Sometimes I wake up and run in here, and it's like I can hear."
She stopped talking, and Marvel didn't start, and in the silence that ensued, Marvel became aware of the faint sound of traffic in the street, and of music seeping from somewhere. The garage, most likely. Anna was looking at her blue hands now, as if she was seeing them for the first time. Marvel watched her open them out and turn them over, peering at the darker lines around her nails, and in the folds of her knuckles. Suddenly John Marvel felt like an intruder. If Anna Buck was crazy, she was crazy for all her own reasons, and they were reasons that were wholly understandable and unbearably sad. "I should go," he said.
"Okay," she said.
"Thanks for the tea."
She nodded almost imperceptibly. She showed no signs of standing up or seeing him out. She didn't even watch him go. Her eyes were fixed now on the 4 blue circles.
"Will you be okay?"
he asked, and actually listened for the answer. She turned and gave him a small, grateful smile.
"When Daniel comes home, everything will be fine."
He stood there, not knowing how to answer her. Finally, he simply said, "Yes." As he left the room, she said,
"Did you find the bell?"
"Excuse me?"
Marvel stopped and turned to look at her again.
"The bicycle bell,"
said Anna dreamily, without turning her face towards him.
"In the drawing I did of the garden. It's on the windowsill."
By the time he next had a cogent thought, Marvel was outside in his car and heading back to the station. He wasn't even sure he'd said goodbye. Edie Evans's bicycle was exactly where Marvel had last seen it a year ago, leaning against the back wall of the evidence room, at the end of a canyon of ceiling-high metal shelving, packed with a vast array of items in clear bags and wire baskets. He peeled back the plastic sheeting that covered the BMX and felt his chest knot up. The back wheel was still buckled, the chain still drooped. The bike's only visitors in a year had been small spiders that had woven the wheels into delicate doilies. The chrome handlebars were still pitted with rust and dusted with print powder. Mr. Evans had told him Edie never had a bell. He'd told Marvel it was an old bike and covered in scratches. He was not lying. About the scratches, at least. But these scratches, these particular scratches, were not old. Not as old as the other ones on the bike, anyway. They were an inch or so from the right hand grip, exactly where a bell would be. And some of the scratches were long and almost parallel, as if the clamp had been twisted back and forth on the bars. Some of them had actually cut through old pimples of rust and trailed it minutely across the surface. There was no bell on the bike, but there was definitely a place where a bell had been. Chapter 28. Edie Evans picked a lamppost and pedaled towards it as fast as she possibly could. Sometimes she would launch into space, if only she got there fast enough, her front wheel lifting and people's eyes popping as they realized that what they had thought was a girl on a bicycle was actually a brave and skilled astronaut on an experimental one-man rocket. Other times she was winning the Tour de France, on a BMX. The crowds called her name and people lifted her onto their shoulders, and more cheering people lifted her little black and white bike onto their shoulders, and they were both carried through the streets of Paris under fountains of champagne. Edie skidded to a juddering halt just beyond the lamppost, spun the bike around in an arc, and pulled a little wheelie. Only a small one because she'd gone over backwards once and nearly knocked herself out, and that had been on grass, not pavement. While she waited for her mother to catch up, she flipped up her visor and gave a TV interview in fluent French, even though the only French she knew was Frère Jacques. "Dormez-vous," she said with a dismissive wave, to show it had been barely an effort at all. And when the interviewer in a beret asked her how it felt to win the greatest cycle race in the world as a 12-year-old girl, she gave a Gallic shrug and said, "Sonnez les matines," and the crowd went wild. Edie turned a half-circle and set off again slowly, and told Houston they needed to adjust the rocket boosters, before she could make another attempt to launch. As she navigated a series of potholes shaped like moon craters, a man fell into step beside her. "Hello," he said.
"Hello,"
said Edie. She knew not to speak to strangers, but she was on a bicycle, and there were loads of people around. "For you," he said, and held out a bicycle bell.
"Oh,"
she said uncertainly. "Stop," he said. So she did, and twisted to look behind her for her mother. She could see her coming, pushing Frankie's buggy. Frankie was too big for a buggy, really, but it was a long walk home for a 4-year-old, and he got stroppy when he was tired. When Edie looked back, the man was using a screwdriver to attach the bell to her bicycle. She didn't want a bell. A rocket ship didn't have a bell, especially not one with a picture of Mickey Mouse on it. Why was he putting a bell on her bike anyway? But she said nothing. He finished quickly, then rang the bell for her to show her how it worked. It was a coarse, rattling sound. "Good?" he said. It wasn't good. It was rubbish. But Edie had been brought up to say please and thank you almost as a reflex, and so she said, "Thank you," and looked around again, to see if there was any sign of Mum. She hoped so, because she wanted an excuse to ride on and not to have to speak to the man anymore. He was friendly and full of smiles, but something about it was not right. She shouldn't have stopped. She shouldn't have said hello. If Mum saw, she would be cross that she'd spoken to a stranger. Edie kept staring over her right shoulder as her mother approached with the 3-wheeled buggy bumping easily over curbs and pavement cracks, as her mind raced through all the explanations she was going to give, all the excuses, if her mother looked up and saw them. And when she turned round again, the man had gone. She didn't even see where. Edie sighed in relief.
"Hi, Eads,"
Mum smiled brightly.
"Chain fall off?" "No," said Edie. "I was just waiting for you."
"Oh, thanks, sweetheart." Edie rode the last 50 yards to Tigger time slowly, and close to Mum. It wasn't very daring, but she could be Neil Armstrong again tomorrow, or next week. Mum went to the moon to get Frankie, and Edie stayed outside, guarding the buggy like Michael Collins. She kept looking around, but the man was nowhere to be seen. She slowly rang the bell. All kinds of little jangly mechanical things clicked and clunked inside it, as if it was broken. It was more grinding than musical. She rang it faster, and it improved, but not much. She wiggled it on the bar, and it moved, so she wrenched it back and forth to see if she could dislodge it by force. Then Mum came out with Frankie. She didn't touch the bell again, or Mum might notice it and ask where it had come from. But Edie thought she should take it off before Dad came home. Chapter 29. Mark Evans opened the door. "Come in," Marvel had called first to say he had no news, but there was still an air of nervous apprehension about the man. Marvel and Brady followed him down the passageway to the kitchen. Breakfast was still on the table, and Frankie was still playing with it.
"Hello, John,"
said Carrie Evans.
"Would you like a cup of tea?"
"No, thanks, Mrs. Evans."
"I'm sorry," she said to Brady. "I've forgotten your name."
"T.S. Brady, ma'am. Colin."
"Colin, of course,"
she said, although Marvel could tell from her expression that she had not remembered Brady's name, nor cared to now. She was just being polite.
"Hi,"
said Frankie, and they both said hi back to him. Then the 4 of them stood in the center of the kitchen, held there by tension. The Evanses looked less haggard than the last time Marvel had seen them. But that expression of tense not knowing put 10 years on a face overnight, and Marvel had never seen it completely reversed. not even on those rare occasions when the result was a home win. He took 3 photos from a card-backed envelope and laid them face up on the counter. "Do you recognize any of these people?" Mr. and Mrs. Evans looked down at them. "Well, we remember Richard, of course," said Mark. "From the case?" "And the church," said Carrie. "I went a couple of times." "Before or after Edie disappeared?" "After," she said. "I didn't realize that," said Marvel, wondering why that wasn't in the file. "Yes," said Carrie. "It was me who suggested asking him for help." That was why. D.S. Short had claimed it was her idea, but then it had backfired on her. Maybe that was why she had gone off and got herself pregnant, and stung the force for leave and pay. Still, it was a coincidence he should have picked up on at the time. Another one. If he hadn't been so keen to distance himself from all the psychic bullshit, he might have known about it back then, back when there was still a chance, perhaps. "I'm not really a believer," Carrie Evans went on. "But you're desperate. You know, you want to believe in something." She shrugged her narrow shoulders and looked out of the kitchen window. "Did Mr. Latham ever come to the house?" "No," said Mark Evans, and when Marvel looked at his wife, she also turned and shook her head. "He wasn't a friend, just a straw to clutch at." Marvel nodded. "And you don't know these two?" "I don't think so," said Mark. "Take your time," Marvel said. They did, while the kitchen clock ticked, and Frankie dribbled milk back into his shredded wheat. "They're not the best pictures in the world," said Carrie Evans. Marvel had taken them both, the Polaroid of Anna Buck and the profile shot of her husband. Mark and Carrie Evans both shook their heads. Then Marvel showed them the photo DCI Lloyd had sent over. Daniel Buck in a Transformers t-shirt, riding a Trafalgar Square lion. "This is Daniel Buck. He attended ticket time, too, and went missing in November." The Evanses pored over the photo for far longer than it must have taken for them to know that they didn't recognize him. Marvel understood the desperation, that need to find a connection, almost willing the fragments of the mystery to come together and form a picture they could understand. He knew they had nothing to tell him, long before they said they were sorry. Marvel picked up all the photos and put them back in the card-backed envelope. "How are they connected to Edie?" said Carrie suspiciously. "I'm not sure they are," said Marvel, "but we are always alert to anything that might be." "Thank you," said Carrie. "We appreciate it." She took her husband's arm and he nodded his agreement. Marvel glanced at the kitchen ceiling. "Would you mind if we had a quick look in Edie's room?" "Of course," said Carrie. "Why?" said Mark. "Just to refresh my memory," Marvel blocked. He wasn't going to tell Mark Evans why they were there. He told himself it was a precaution. After all, Mr. Evans was the one who had said there was no bell, so he wasn't going to reveal right up front that they were interested in finding one. Just in case. He also wasn't going to confess that he'd been sent to find a bicycle bell seen in a vision by a certifiable nutcase. He hadn't even told Brady that they were here because of Anna Buck. "Of course," said Mark. "Thank you," said Marvel. "We won't be long." Mark nodded and sighed and gestured back towards the stairs. "Well," he said, "you know where it is." Marvel did. The bedroom was exactly as he remembered it. He stood at the door and looked around while he wiggled his fingers into the powdered latex gloves. The same posters and pictures, the same books on the shelves, the same mishmash of tomboy toys, the same mouse running circles in the same wheel. He walked across the room towards the old-fashioned sash window.
"Where shall I start, sir?"
said Brady. But Marvel didn't answer him. About 6 feet from the window, a strange tingling feeling came over John Marvel. Weird. The human brain was hardwired to notice the slightest anomaly, the tiniest deviation from the norm. The scar on the face, the limp in the gait, the floor speeding by on the factory conveyor belt. But sometimes the brain caught a glimpse of something so weird that it had to take a second look to make sure. He backed up a few paces, then reached into his pocket and took out the sketch that Anna Buck had done of the garden through the window. Then, very slowly, he walked forward again until his hips were almost against the windowsill.
"Sir?"
said Brady again, still waiting for instructions.
"Where shall I start?"
Marvel ignored him and very slowly bent his knees. Too low. He raised himself up, pressing the wall for support, half squatting, thinking of the super and his wife and their piston joints, until he reached the perfect height. The height of Edie Evans. A cold shiver ran up his back.
"Sir?"
Marvel held the sketch out in front of him from this height. The perspective matched perfectly. The old wooden window frame, the sweep of the flower beds, even the dark scribbled areas, which Marvel now saw were the walls at either side of the window and the trees beyond the garden. It was amateurish, but it was all absolutely right. "Here," he said softly. "We start here." The thing he had thought was a flower inside the room was on the right bottom corner of the window frame that Anna Buck had sketched. Now Marvel looked down at the right corner of the windowsill. It was old and broad, and had cracked along the grain. He pressed his fingers into the wood alongside the crack, and it tilted downwards, opening a dark triangle in the sill. Marvel blocked the light as he tried to peer into the space, so he reached in blind, hoping nothing bit him. His beefy fingers barely fit through the gap, but he managed to pinch something between 2 fingers and to lift it out, dangling like a prize from a seaside arcade machine, and drop it into his other hand. It was a Mickey Mouse bicycle bell. Was it possible? He was holding it in his hand, but still Marvel wasn't sure it was possible. His mind was almost completely rational when he was sober, and he had been sober for a long time now, so he struggled with the irrationality of finding the bell exactly where Anna Buck had said it would be. She must have been here. It was the only explanation. She must have seen the view from Edie Evans's bedroom window and hidden the bell for them to find. Maybe Richard Latham had been here and told Anna Buck about it. Or had somebody been in Edie's bedroom for even more criminal reasons? But who? James Buck, who wasn't to be trusted with children? Mark Evans, who had insisted that the bell did not exist? Marvel was suddenly bombarded with suspects and possibilities, when before he'd had none. It didn't matter. Rather too many suspects than too few, and any one of those explanations would have satisfied him. Any one would have been something he could work with, follow up, write in a report, put to his super. Live with. The only other explanation was not rational, and Marvel shied away from it, even though it was what had led him here, to this dark crack and this shining bell. That explanation was that Anna Buck had a psychic connection to Edie Evans, or to her killer. That she possessed mystical powers, and had the secrets of the universe at her fingertips. When she wasn't trying to jump in front of a train, of course. Or breastfeeding a fucking doll.
"Oh," said Brady. "You found it."
He sounded disappointed, as if tearing a 12-year-old's bedroom apart had been top of his bucket list. "Give me an evidence bag," said Marvel. Brady opened the bag for him, and he dropped the bell into it.
"How did you know where to look, sir?"
"Just a hunch," said Marvel. Chapter 30. James Buck woke with his wife screaming beside him.
"Get it off me! Get it off!"
She was thrashing crazily, slapping at her own face and head, gripping great handfuls of hair and trying to tear it out by the roots.
"Anna!" he shouted. "Anna! Wake up!"
She didn't. Instead, she started to punch and kick him, hysterical with terror. James rolled out of bed, turned on the light and picked his spot. He hit her. Just once, but just right. An open-handed slap to the face that woke her and stopped her in the same instant. She looked at him with wide, shocked eyes.
"Thank you,"
she said, and burst into tears. He got back into bed beside her and held her while she cried. It was the first time she'd let him hold her in 5 months. She had lost so much weight. Everywhere James touched her, he could feel her bones through the thin, stretched skin. He hadn't noticed. He had hardly seen her naked in all that time. But touching her now, he felt a jagged edge of fear. He'd already been worried about her mental state, what with the church and the police and the blue circles. But her physical frailty was now obvious to his hands in brutal relief.
"What happened?"
he said next to her ear, but she was crying too hard to tell him. But she did allow him to hold her, to stroke her inflamed cheek, to spoon up behind her and soothe her like a baby, with soft shushes while she sobbed out her fear, until she knew she was here and not there, and could speak again. When she did, she spoke so softly that James had to lean even closer, putting his ear on her neck to hear her.
"There was an alien,"
she said. James didn't laugh. She was too upset.
"It had this metal thing, like a crown with wires, and it put it on my head."
She ended in a small whining sound, and touched her own head, as if she could still feel it there. And James touched her hair gently, reassuringly, in those same places.
"You're safe now," he said.
"I know. It was only a dream."
"I know,"
she said again.
"But it felt so real."
He squeezed her, and she let him. They lay together while the room grew light. Anna was quiet for so long that James thought she had fallen asleep. He was close to dozing off himself, when she whispered,
"They want to know what I'm thinking."
Chapter 31. Marvel laid all his new evidence before Superintendent Robert Clyde, and submitted an official request to be put back on the Edie Evans case.
"But, John," said Clyde, "this isn't evidence. This is speculation based on the supernatural rantings of a mentally disturbed woman." "What about the bicycle bell, sir?" "What about it?" said Clyde. "Look, I'm not being facetious, but really, what about it? It's a bell from a bicycle. Granted, you found it under unusual circumstances, but even if I believed that this woman saw it in a crystal ball and led you to a big spot marked with an X, what does it tell us about what happened to Edie Evans? How does it help?" "Sir, the garden, the other drawings, the bicycle bell, I'm not sure we can just ignore all these things. I'm not saying Anna Buck's not bonkers. I think she's as mad as a bucket of frogs. But maybe she's being used without understanding it. Maybe she has some involvement, some knowledge, and this is the only way she can reveal it. Maybe she knows much more about the Edie Evans case than even she knows. There may be other insights she could offer.
are the leads that might emerge from things she says that will prove to be useful, maybe even vital.
Clyde got up and shut the window. It was Friday afternoon, and the demand for kebabs started early.
You know my feelings on psychics, Marvel.
A little alarm went off in Marvel's head. Whatever happened to John?
I do, sir, he said, and I share them, believe me. That's why I work so hard to get Mitzi returned to Mrs. Clyde as soon as possible, to avoid embarrassment for you, sir.
Marvel hoped the super knew that he meant more than just the embarrassment of a wife and a small fluffy dog. Had the man forgotten so soon that he had paid £1,000 reward, no questions asked, to some anonymous kid? How embarrassing would that have been for Clyde if it had got out? Very. The super owed him, big time, even if it was only for not revealing the humiliating details to the entire second floor. Owed him a bloody sight more than putting him back on the Edie Evans case. That should be just for starters. Apparently, Clyde didn't see things the same way.
I don't think your suspicions hold water, said Clyde, and I certainly don't feel that re-examining the Evans case on the basis of such tenuous evidence would be worthwhile.
Marvel could feel it slipping away from him.
Superintendent Jeffries seemed to think it was worthwhile, sir. Well, maybe that's why Superintendent Jeffries is gone and I'm here, said Clyde sharply. That case has been a bloody embarrassment to the force, to be frank, from beginning to bloody end.
He sighed, then went on more kindly.
The trouble with the Evans case, John, is that you want it too much.
Marvel stared at him in mute wonder. The fucking idiot! How could you want to solve a murder too much? It would be like being too keen on world peace, too anti-cancer. He suddenly knew he wasn't dealing with a reasoned argument, so he stopped and reassessed the situation. Superintendent Clyde was a prick. A lamb-scented prick with a fat wife, a gay dog, and a bull's cock on his living room wall. But Marvel wanted back on the Edie Evans case, and he still wanted that promotion. And he needed Clyde on his side on both counts. The Mitzi strategy had gone wrong on him, but there was still leverage in the matter of the reward. Whatever Robert Clyde said. When the kid who'd brought the dog home finally came back for his money, Marvel would be all over him like acne. He'd show the super that when he was given a job to do, he finished it, and got results. So although it churned him up inside to do it, he backed down.
Maybe you're right, sir.
Clyde looked somewhat mollified.
Good man,
he said enthusiastically.
That's the spirit.
Arsehole, thought Marvel. Screw Superintendent Clyde. If he couldn't close the Mitzi-Clyde case with his superior's support, he'd do it alone. He'd ask some questions, get some answers, be a bloody detective. He couldn't wait to see Clyde's face when he unravelled the scam and handed him back his £1,000 for good measure. And when he'd done that, then they'd be back in business on the Edie Evans case. Psychic or no bloody psychic.